Welcome everyone. My name is Ben Novak. I'm a cattleman from Elbron, Iowa, and currently serve as the Executive Committee Representative of NCBA's Young Beef Leader Advisory Group from Region 3. NCBA's Young Beef Leader program is focused on education, engagement, networking, and development of the next generation of beef industry leaders through engagement with NCBA's state and breed-affiliated organizations and incorporation into industry meetings and events. I have the privilege of serving alongside 7 regional representatives who make up the steering committee. Ryan Miller, Region 1, Kentucky. Jacob Nias from Region 2 in Georgia. Myself, Ben Novak, Region 3, Iowa. April Bonds, Region 4, Texas. Matt Hunt, Region 5, Colorado. Jason Small, Region 6, Hawaii. And Keith Bryant, Region 7, Kansas. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the chat box on your screen, and at the end of the presentation, questions will be moderated by our presenter. If you have trouble with your technology, or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar is being recorded and will be available in a few days at beefusa.org. On behalf of YBL's education series, we're pleased to present Business Planning 101 with Devon Cook of Ag Progress. Devon works with farm and ranch businesses to navigate through transitions from generational changes in management or ownership, or transitions while building the organization's team and abilities during growth. In addition to working with individual clients, Ag Progress facilitates peer groups and an agricultural executive education program. The Progress Coach. Devon's entire career has spanned agriculture, ranging from co-managing her family's cotton gin to ConAgra and McKinsey & Company, to international ag development in Africa with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She has seen the need for and execution of good planning in all those environments. Devon resides in northern Colorado with her husband and 2 children. This evening's webinar is brought to you by NCBA's Young Beef Leader program and our partners at Ag Progress. Devon?
Thank you, Ben, for that introduction, and thanks to NCBA for inviting me. It's really good to be with the Young Beef Leaders group again. Sorry, I'm trying to get all my screen pieces worked out here, so give me just a moment. So as Ben said, we at Ag Progress work with hundreds of farms and ranches and livestock operations individually and via peer groups and education groups. And so I hear and see many conversations in a given year. And so on tonight's topic of business planning, I hope to share some themes with you and give you a few snapshot examples of tools that I've seen work with ag operations. But these certainly aren't the only tools, and there's not one way to do it. So my goal is really to get you thinking about how good planning can be a strength for your business and give you some ideas of how to get started. So what we're going to do tonight is basically talk about why plan. Why should we even be having this conversation? And I appreciate those of you that are listening to this because obviously you have some interest in the topic. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of some different types of plans because there's lots of different taxonomies or categorizations of different types of business plans. So I'm going to give you my version of that to give you some exposure. And then we're going to take a deep dive into one of those, which we chose for tonight, the operating plan, and we'll show you a little bit more specific tools on it. So first question, why are we here and why do I even care about business planning? This Dilbert cartoon that you're seeing might suggest don't bother. Dilbert cartoons, make fun of the corporate world and the corporate world's mumbo jumbo. And we kind of, sometimes in small businesses and in ag, roll our eyes at some of that formality. We tend to be smaller ships and tighter ships, and we can be really focused on getting things done and don't always necessarily think that there's a need for a lot of structure. But in my line of work with ag clients, we use a couple of sayings that once my clients hear them and get used to them, they think, yes, that rings pretty true. And the first of those is, in the absence of structure, people default to the status quo. So I ask you, what is the status quo in your business? Is the status quo, we're going to do it like we always have? Is the status quo that we're going to kind of make it up as we go along? Or is the status quo that we're going to do it how mom's always done it? And you know, there's lots of different ways we have status quos, but the question is, are you satisfied with the status quo? Now, in some cases, the default or the status quo can be a really good thing. If I think about values that have been held for generations across some of our businesses, those are probably a pretty good status quo. But on the not good or the bad side of status quo is we can really get stuck in a rut of we never change anything. So an example I have seen with several clients is trying to change the status quo around who does what. Maybe dad said, I always run the sprayer. I've been running the sprayer for 30 years and I'm going to run it forever because I'm the best at it. Well, some folks in some of those businesses have said, well, maybe it's time we change that plan. We need to intentionally develop some successors for you, Dad. And so this year we're going to have a plan in place that Joe is going to run the sprayer, you know, half the time to get the experience and to free you up, Dad, for some higher value activities. So that's just one really example of sometimes having an intentional plan, and that example around how you're going to deploy people really can be a positive change to the status quo. So I would say, why plan? If you're not defining a specific plan, you're leaving people to make up their own. And that really brings me to the second of my favorite sayings, which is, in the absence of a story, people make one up. And we see this all the time with the folks that we work with. What story are you or your employees or your family members making up? I've heard stories about which kid is in charge or not. I've heard stories that the company's going to be sold because the owners were holed up in a room all day with the financial advisor or the accountant. I've heard stories that Mike must be getting fired because they sold his pickup. So those were instances of all really specific aspects of planning that were going on, but they weren't being communicated. So that's the other aspect of planning. It's not just making the good decisions together, but it's also making sure you're communicating them and giving people the right story. So this diagram shows you a life cycle that we use quite a bit to think about at what stage is a family business or even a closely held smaller business. You know, you start out survival and then progress up through stable, professional, and in some cases to institutional. For a lot of the folks I work with, they are either stable or professional, or vast majority of them are somewhere in between. And they're trying to make that progression towards being more professional. And when you read that box of professional, you see that ownership has spread to multiple generations, the business is growing, there may be non-family management, and suddenly you have more people involved and it becomes more important to have some structure. It becomes more important to make decisions as a team and be able to communicate those decisions. And that's where this aspect of business planning really becomes more and more relevant. So let's talk about what are some of the different types of business plans that I see. So the first one I think about is strategic planning. And this is certainly probably a word you've heard and maybe heard it and had a little bit of roll your eyes of corporate mumbo jumbo sense. When I Google strategic planning, I got 107 million results, and I think they might cut it off. There's probably more than that. When I searched for strategic planning books on Amazon, I got over 13,000. So obviously, this is a topic that a lot of people have opinions on the best way to do it. I'm gonna show you one framework here tonight, but I don't care which template or which book you read or which version you read. The main idea is that strategic planning is about getting a big picture view of where are you now, where are you going, how are you going to get there, and how will you measure progress. And like I said, we're not going to have time tonight on this webinar to go into all of these types of plans, but there are plenty of resources out there for you for strategic planning. Another way to think about strategic planning you may have heard is working on the business versus working in the business. So I know they talk about that at the Ranching for Profit School and probably other conferences you've been to. And the concept is, we can get very caught up every day in the operations and what needs done today and really tactical stuff. And taking a step back to think strategically about your business and what the long-term plan is. In this case, I said about 3 to 5 years. It's a fairly typical time frame to be thinking about strategic planning. One other tool I would mention to you as a reference that I've heard a lot of people finding helpful is a book called Traction. It's by a gentleman named Gino Wickman, and it's a pretty hands-on tactical method. He calls it the Entrepreneurial Operating System, or EOS, and it's a method really for setting long-term goals for your company and then translating those into execution in the shorter term, which will get to the next type of plan that I'm going to talk about some in the operating plan. But just wanted to give you that resource because I've heard a lot of discussion about it lately, and am helping some clients implement that within their organizations. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is, what are our 3 or 5 year goals that go beyond maximizing production or maximizing profit? I mean, those are kind of a given in most businesses that we're trying to make a profit. But strategic planning is thinking more about how you're going to do that in the big picture. So in a livestock context, that might mean, are we going to move towards a new production system? Are we trying to open new locations in a different state or in a different region? Are we trying to really improve the financial management capacity of our organization? So maybe the strategic plan is working towards getting our books in order, getting our analysis in order, and potentially hiring a CFO to make that happen. Those are just a few examples of how you think about these things as bigger picture goals. Now let's move to one level down, which is the operating plan. And that's really this year and at the end of this year, planning for next year. But this is kind of 1 year time frames to think about how are we going to make the goals in that strategic plan actually happen on an operational basis. So an operating plan pretty simply is, what are we going to make? I mean, what are we going to produce or grow or sell? And that decision obviously needs to be based on some sound analysis. And we'll get a little bit more into this one as our deep dive later. And then not only what are we going to make, but how? How are we going to deploy financial capital and human capital to make that possible? The next type of plan I want to share is one that we don't want to happen to us, but I would tell you is really important. And that's the business continuity plan. What happens when all the great strategic plan and operation plan go off the rails because something went wrong? So for example, what happens if a critical leader is suddenly unavailable? Unfortunately, people on this webinar have experienced this or seen it up close and seen the turmoil that not only someone can be going through in their personal life with an illness or a death, but also in your professional life. And the question is, are you ready for that? Now this is not hard stuff. I mean, honestly, sitting down and writing a business continuity plan could be as simple as a couple of hours. Just getting some basic facts on the paper. But a lot of us haven't done it. And I've seen this happen to folks time and again. So your goal is to answer these basic questions. I mean, does your spouse know who to call or what to do as a first step? Who is qualified to make decisions? I mean, who in the organization has some authority? Who would you delegate that authority to? Who should the trusted advisors be? Where are the critical documents? You know, most of us know that we might have a safe or we have a safety deposit box at the bank, but even beyond that, you know, where are the financial statements from last year that might be a really important resource I would need? Or where are the insurance policies? I mean, just truly a rundown on where do I find the information I would need. And then finally, a simple one that seems pretty obvious, but I wish I put a poll into this webinar to ask how many people right now have given someone else instructions on how to get to all of their computer or online passwords. That's one we overlook, but in today's world we are so dependent on all those accounts that it's really important for a business. So again, this one's not hard. You just got to sit down and do it. And then once you do it, the next piece is make sure you give it to the people that are going to need to know that information. The next type of plan that I want to expose you to is estate and succession plan. And I know you've heard those words thrown around a lot in agriculture and pretty much every magazine you read or every conference you go to. And I like to think about this as the really big picture. So the picture got a little bit larger than the strategic plan because this is really one that merits significant time and attention, but will vary in its importance kind of based on the life cycle of your business. The first thing I want to do is just clarify the terms estate and succession plan because they often get muddled and used pretty interchangeably. The estate plan is the process of transitioning the stuff, the assets, the hard physical and financial assets from one generation to the next. The succession plan, I will tell you, is a lot less defined and probably takes longer to accomplish and can be a lot more challenging. And I like to think of a succession plan in a context of it's more than just figuring out who's going to be the next boss or who's going to sit in your chair. The succession plan is really a process of co-creating psychological ownership among a group of people that are going to be continuing the business, maybe across multiple generations. And so in a family business context, this obviously includes all the family members that are going to be future shareholders. But I would continue to say succession plan also needs to include key employees and understanding, helping them understand too, what are the future vision and goals and future strategies of this organization. Now we've been, I'm generally talking tonight with a lens of family business, but I know that we very well may have attendees on here that are involved in non-family owned businesses, and I think a lot of these concepts apply as well. And a succession plan, I assure you that in the corporate world, that is very much a hot topic, is always thinking about how we're preparing for succession in leadership. So obviously this is a topic that could be several webinars on its own, and I think NCBA has sponsored some of those in the past and will in the future as well. But just be aware that this is definitely one that's critical to most of our ag operations. So in summary, we've kind of talked about at a really high level these four types of plans: strategic, operating, business continuity, and estate and succession plan. Those are kind of my definition of how I would organize the overall topic of business planning. And then, like I said, you could probably find a lot of other viewpoints on how to characterize that. But this leads me to the question of, wow, that's a lot of plans. Why should I bother? Or I'm overwhelmed and I don't know where to start. And I want to be really clear. I want my message to be distinct tonight from the business books you can read, or there's a bestseller. It seems like every week a new business bestseller, and you can get sort of overwhelmed trying to absorb all of that information. You can find 101 ways to do every one of those plans. But at the end of the day, what we see in our practice is the value is in the communication and the clarity. So it doesn't matter if you do the plan perfectly. The fact that you're having the conversations, so you're communicating and you're providing clarity is just really, really valuable to the success of your business. So on the communication side, we've already seen, I've already shared with you these maxims of the absence of structure, or in the absence of a story, you're leaving people to take their best guess or to rely on the status quo. Now let's talk about this concept of clarity. Why is planning so important to provide clarity? My friend Dick Whitman loves to say a decision is never made until it's put on paper. And this is so true. I see this happening all the time with the companies that I work with. Putting your plan or your decisions on paper is really important for two reasons. First, it forces a deeper thought and reflection when you have to articulate it on paper. When you see those words in black and white and you have to nod your head and say, yes, I agree to that, it forces all of us to pay attention and think it through in a different way. And the second reason is for the accountability and the memory that having things written down on paper is for. And we're pretty guilty of this in small businesses of, we're moving fast and it's a fairly small number of people, so we just think everybody agreed, everybody got it. And that's not necessary. But I see the power of this all the time in holding people accountable later on, and even just refreshing your memory when a year from now you're talking about a decision that was made a year ago, and lots of stuff's happened between now and then. I had a client just last week who I'd been preaching this to. We've had I guess about 2 group meetings, and through those interactions and phone calls, it's become really clear that that's been sorely lacking for them. That people can leave the meeting with a really different interpretation, and then it leads to lots of conflict later. And the client said to me, man, Devon, you were really right about that. And that's so far the most important thing we've gotten out of this process. So that's one of the aspects of business planning that's so important, is it forces you to have that, that process and that deeper thought. And finally, progress over perfection. So we named our firm Ag Progress for a reason, because we think it's so important that you not get bogged down in perfection. I'm going to show you some examples later of different tools you can use for an operating plan, and you may get 80% of the way there and you may get 30% of the way there, but the point is you're making progress. And I assure you, the magic is not in having the perfect method. The magic is in the fact that you're doing it and the communication that it creates. So let me give you a real life example of how getting a strategic plan has been really important for a successful farm and ranch that we know. This group of owners, which is led by 2 family members, has one family member that, from a historical perspective, is really focused on buying land and building wealth via acres, because that's how the family has always accumulated net worth. I mean, acres equals net worth, and that was how success was defined. So this partner wants to use the available cash to buy land because it's always turned out well in the past. The other family member has been doing a lot of research and reading and has really come to believe that turnover and cash flow and asset efficiency are really the keys to the future, especially in a down cycle. So this individual is thinking about things like confined feeding operations and other cash flow oriented businesses and wants to use their cash there. So these 2 partners are really headed 2 different directions, and they're kind of giving conflicting signals to the other people working there as far as how they prioritize people's work, or even how the other owners perceive the future of the business. So once they realize that, they realize that, hey, both of these approaches could be good. There's no right or wrong answer, but it is really important that we get on the same page as far as having a strategic plan that's pulling the right direction. And they also realize that those 2 different paths are going to result in really different financial metrics. So kind of depending on how you're reading the financials, you could read them really positively or really negatively. I mean, depending on your lens. So they realized it was really important to start getting on the same page and deciding what defines success. So for them, it's been a balance, a compromise of thinking about, okay, what are the number of acres that we could buy in a year and still have enough dollars to invest in businesses with higher cash turnover. So they're setting some goals of, our 3 to 5 year plan is to buy X acres every year and invest X dollars into some cash flow businesses, and that's really taking shape for them. And it helps them communicate that with their employees, with their larger family of investors that really need to understand the risk and rewards that they can expect from the business as well. So we see examples like that, fairly regularly, where the status quo may be assumed, but maybe is not where some people want to take the business in the future. So it's important to have those conversations. So next for tonight's webinar, I would like to take a deeper dive into the operating plan. But before we do that, I want to get a pulse from you on the webinar of where you think you're at with an operating plan. So in a moment, you're going to see a poll pop up on your screen, and I want you to answer this question. Does your business today have a thorough operating plan that does these three things? That determines what you'll produce this year based on sound analysis, that defines what resources you will need to do so, and third, don't forget the last one, is understood and communicated with all of the relevant stakeholders. So you're going to see a poll pop up. Just do a quick reply and we'll get a sense of where the group's at. Okay, so Josh, I was not able to see the results of that. So why don't you send me a chat and give me a sense of what the answers were from the group. We'll come back to those results in a minute. Sorry about that. So let's get started on the operating plan. What's involved in that? And I think of this as 5 buckets, if you will. The first one is production. I mean, at a basic level, what are we going to grow, raise, or process to create value? So sounds like a pretty basic question, but obviously we'll get into in a moment a little bit more of how you go about making that decision. So now I can see your poll results. It says 73% of you answered that somewhat. You have something of an operating plan. And that's a bit of a loaded question before I've sort of given you my definition. So we're going to ask that same question at the end of the webinar and see what you're thinking after you see some of these examples. But 73% answered somewhat, 19% answered no, and 8% answered yes. So it looks like we definitely have some opportunity to build that out for you. So the first one is production. What are we gonna make? Second is marketing. How are we gonna sell it? And how are we gonna manage that price risk? Third is physical capital replacement, meaning what equipment, what assets are we going to need to use and purchase and sell and replace this year to make it happen? Fourth is how are we gonna pay for it? Financing. And fifth is how are we gonna get it done? What people, what human capital are we going to use to put this plan into action? And that's one I will tell you that just seems to be a pain point all across ag and across all the operations that I work with, is trying to continue to get talented labor and to keep them and keep the developing them. So we will talk more about each one of these pieces. So first, production. Now, this is not a budgeting or a financial analysis webinar tonight, obviously. I just am going to show you a couple of tools because I just want to make sure that you're aware that there are numerous tools out there for you via extension services, via NCBA, via other seminars you go to. There's lots of tools, but the important piece of it is that you are gathering information to really decide what's the most profitable course for your business. And some of this stuff, as you get experience, you make some decisions by gut. But I would argue that there is, in today's world where margins are thin, there's just not much room for error. Taking the time to really do your analysis is critical. So you may be making decisions between enterprises. You may be making decisions like, am I going to feed out all of my steers? Am I going to change my feeding system? So for each production cycle, so each year in the life of your business, or in a cattle context, it may be more than a year, but each production cycle, you need to have evaluated the pros and cons and the profit of each alternative production system and made a plan to follow it. So obviously on this one, budget and really good financial information being available is critical, and financial information being available on a weekly and a monthly and in an annual basis. So here's an example. I mean, again, this is one of many, 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 but this is a spreadsheet from the University of Nebraska where they have a cow herd system budget. And it lets you evaluate all the different components of the system. They've got tabs for the cost of bulls and replacement heifers. They've got tabs for the profit and loss of the breeding herd, the winter calves, the stockers, the feeders, and the entire system as a whole. I think the one I'm showing on the screen is for stockers only. But just notice that it shows you variable costs, fixed costs, and non-cash costs like depreciation. So, really these are the building blocks of being able to do a really sound financial analysis. And the question at the end of the day is, are you evaluating each of your enterprises and making a really well-informed decision for each production cycle of whether you should be doing more of this or less of that? In a crop context, here's a tool that I have a friend that uses from a row crop producer in Kansas. So these are old numbers, they're not going to mean anything today, but he has a simple spreadsheet that he uses that calculates the cost and profit for each crop. So if you go across the top there, he's considering wheat versus corn versus milo or sorghum versus soybeans, and then double crop corn or double crop soybeans. And so he's looking at those costs per acre, and on the bottom half of the page, he's got the ability to run different scenarios with different numbers of passes through the field, different fertilizer programs, etc. So, this is his version. You can find a bunch more, but the point is, again, that you have the ability to really run scenarios and do that really sound financial planning to decide what's the right production plan for the next cycle. So that gets us to the second piece of the operating plan, and that's marketing. How and when will we sell our products, and equally as important, how will we manage that price risk? So I am not a futures and options expert. I'm not the person you want giving you market advice. There's lots of seminars you can go to for that. But the point again is that you just got to do it. You've got to have the rigor to get a marketing plan in place ahead of time instead of it being a spur of the moment decision. So it's going to be guided by your risk tolerance. It's going to define what tools you will use or you will not use. And to have a good marketing plan, it goes back to the previous slide of it's really, really critical to know your costs. So I'm going to show you an example here from Mark Welch at Texas A&M that I've seen him teach. And this is really simple. It's a one-page summary that he coaches people through to get their marketing plan on. It's not a 20-page document. It's a one-page summary that helps you think about the different phases of the crop year and, define things like what reports are you going to watch? I mean, what are your information sources going to be in that time of the year? How much are you going to market at each time of the year? Some people set a goal of what percentage do you want to sell pre-plant and during the growing season and at harvest. What's your price target based on, again, knowing your break-even cost? And what tools will you use or not use? So, meaning, are you a person that only buys options like puts and calls, or are you a person that's willing to take the risk of selling puts and calls? Are you a person that uses complicated option strategies, or do you like to keep it really simple with hedging contracts, with futures contracts? So these are the types of things that he asks you to think about to define your marketing plan. The next slide is a little bit more of his tools that says, let's put some of these pieces together. Let's have the contract's performance through time graphed along with at the top there how much of the crop you're going to sell and what are the information sources you're looking at during that part of the season. So this he uses as a learning tool. So if you start tracking it over a number of years, you can kind of go back and do some postmortems to think about what you learned from that year's marketing experience. So again, there's numerous forms and ways to do it. But another aspect of marketing that I think often gets overlooked and that we have been working more with clients on is the governance concept of marketing. Because lots of times there's a lot of stress in a closely held or family business that there's one person that maybe is carrying the stress of making these really tough decisions. And even in the corporate world, there's pressure on that system. I mean, that's a big performance metric. So it leads to this question sometimes of who's in charge of marketing, and it can lead to conflict if other stakeholders, partners, or whoever are second-guessing that person, or rightfully so, expecting to be kept in the loop and have an understanding of what risks are going on with marketing. So we see a fair amount of conflict in family businesses about marketing. And so we work with clients on this concept of what's the governance system for marketing. And it means what are the checks and balances you have in there? Have you decided as a group your risk tolerance and what instruments you're willing to use or not? Has the group seen a marketing plan ahead of the year and understands what the price targets are and approved of that plan instead of, you know, one person doing it and taking on all of that stress and responsibility? Typically, the governance plan also defines how much leeway the person executing has. I mean, what is their area of authority before they have to come back to the rest of the owners and say, hey, I need permission to take on a bigger position, and it's going to lead to higher margin calls or whatever the case may be. And also the governance plan really sets the expectations of what the reporting time frame and information is going to be. I mean, as a shareholder of the company that's not doing the marketing, am I only going to get updated once a year, or are we going to have a conversation about this at our quarterly meeting so that I'm kept in the loop? So this may be something you want to think about. You know, it can be pretty extensive and formal, or it can be pretty succinct, but lots of times people don't explicitly talk about what are the rules of who makes marketing decisions and with what breadth of authority. The next aspect of the operating plan is the physical capital replacement. And, you know, pretty simply, this means what assets do we need to execute this operating plan for next year? What are we going to buy, sell, replace, repair, etc.? So here's a pretty simple example. And, you know, you can do this in a fancy spreadsheet. You can do it on a Big Chief tablet. I don't care. Again, the point is you are communicating as a group and bringing clarity to what the plan is. And this one you can see is prioritized, which I think is really important. So the top section's what's for sale, you know, what we can expect some cash flow from these sales. And then the second portion is what do we need to buy and what cash flow do we need to be preparing for to do so. But notice the priority A, B, and C. This is important because not only does it help you get it done, it also helps you kind of hold each other accountable. You know, I've seen situations where majority owner or senior generation is really passionate about a specific thing and may go spend some money off the plan. So if grandpa loves milling and he goes and buys the milling machine at the bottom of the list and spends $7,000 on it, even more than it was on the budget for, you know, that brings up a conversation. And again, it brings up the communication. And it's not even that it's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, your conversation may result in a conclusion that, you know, that's really important to Grandpa, and he's at a point in his career where he expects to have some freedom to enjoy the fruits of his labors for many years. So, you know, we probably should just be realistic and prepare that there's going to be some of those purchases. So if that's the outcome of the conversation, that's fine. But at least having this down on a piece of paper makes people discuss what the expectations are, and then loop back to the expectations if they aren't executed as well, so that you can continue to get on the same page. So this is a simple concept, but I'd be curious about how many of you actually have, as a management group, every year come up with a prioritized list like this. And then it's not only deciding what you're going to buy, but how are you going to pay for it? I mean, how are you going to finance it? Or you've also got to make the decision of, are we going to buy it? Are we going to lease it? Are we going to custom hire this operation instead of owning equipment? This is a tool from Iowa State. It's a spreadsheet tool that helps you analyze that buy versus lease decision. And there's lots of tools like this out there. And I'll say, you know, we see lots of situations where operations make the decision to buy equipment because they can. I mean, because they can afford it, or they do have the cash. But maybe if you did a really impartial economic analysis, you would discover that the break-even point for owning versus leasing the tractor is, you know, say 300 hours a year. So if you're putting 500 hours on it, it makes sense to buy it. If you're only putting 200 hours on it, it makes sense to lease it. But lots of times we don't necessarily do that analysis to make the right financial decision. And on that note, we also sometimes get lost in the trees. So, you know, I'm guilty of this myself. I can get sucked into spending 5 hours on the internet researching how to get the best deal on my, you know, $2,000 four-wheeler, you know, whether I'm going to be able to save $100 here or there, but I may not put the same rigor into this type of analysis to decide, okay, what's the best way to get access to the $200,000 combine that I need, or I may not want to pay a consulting fee to my financial advisor to do that analysis for me, but in the long run, that's really a much more important decision for your operation. So make sure that your physical capital replacement aspect of the operating plan also thinks about how is the best way for me to get access to using that asset. The next piece of the operating plan is financing. How are we going to finance the needs? And, you know, there's a few aspects to this. There's, first of all, understanding your cash flow and what financing you need. And that goes back to having that good budget and financial controls in place. And then it's how to communicate that with your lender. I mean, how do you show up at your annual or twice annual meeting with your lender with the right information? I recently heard Peter Martin from Keiko Isom, accounting and consulting firm, talk about how to present to your lender, and he comes from a financial background at a bank. And he said, you know, at the end of the day, it's really fairly simple. You need to demonstrate to your lender, number one, that you have a plan for full repayment. I mean, you have an operating plan on paper that is going to result this year in full repayment of this loan. And second, that you have the team of people in place to execute that plan. And so every single interaction you have with your bank should strive to build confidence in those two things, that you have a plan for repayment and that you have the people to execute it. Another conversation I hear a lot about is consider all your financing sources. You know, there's bank financing, but there's also non-traditional financing out there, whether that's, you know, financing from input suppliers or shopping a range of banks. I haven't seen a number of operations that have gotten in the habit of every winter getting their lender package together and shopping it around to 2 or 3 banks. And not that they necessarily intend to leave their current bank or that they're unhappy, but they're really doing it as contingency planning and an investment in the future so that if something does go wrong, they already have a relationship with an alternative bank. So just be thinking about what are all of your different sources. And then finally, know your debt. What does know your debt mean? I mean, most people have on your balance sheet, you've got a line for current liabilities and long-term liabilities. So you probably know those numbers in total. But how many of you have in one place a spreadsheet or a list of the specific payments and the timing you owe over the next 10 years? Here's an example that I've seen someone use, and it just literally year by year shows all those different obligations. And by looking at this total line at the bottom, this operation is really able to plan long term. So when you think about a strategic plan where they're thinking several years out, they can look here and say, wow, and in 2022, our debt obligation really starts dropping significantly. And if we think about expansion plans of building a new hay shed or a geographical expansion, that may be the time frame we should be working towards. They also have a situation here where they have a obligation longer term in the future of part of their estate planning and succession planning with their family is that starting in 2019, they've got to start buying out the grandparents' home farm or home house tract. And so, just having the visibility of keeping that on the long-term radar, I think is really helpful. And again, this is a simple tool, but it helps you really know your debt at a different level. And the final aspect of the operations plan is human capital. Now, I'm going to share with you some concepts that originally came from the book Good to Great by Jim Collins way back in 2001. This is a classic, really widely cited, and I'm actually rereading it right now, and it's still helpful after all these years. And one of the concepts from Good to Great that you've probably heard is that first you get the right people on the bus. The people that fit your values and your culture and your work ethic. And the opposite, that you get the wrong people off the bus, meaning the people that don't fit. And I've counseled many clients, or mostly listened through many clients as they worked through the tough decision of getting people off the bus that don't fit. And none of us like to let go of people or do it glibly, but I will tell you, when it's been a strategic decision, I seldom hear people regretting it later. But the concept is you get the right people on the bus, and then you worry about getting them in the right seats. I mean, meaning getting them assigned to the right roles or the right work. Now, I realize this is a lot easier said than done because we work in remote locations and we have limited labor pools in ag. But think of it in terms of this example. Maybe I don't have to go out and recruit the very best AI experts to have on my team. I don't have to find the the shining star in that labor pool. Maybe I find a smart person that likes to learn new things, that likes science, that likes cattle, and that fits our culture and our values. And then I help them learn how to be fantastic at AI, and I invest in their education and their experience. So that's one way to think about this human capital piece. And honestly, this example I just gave is a little bit more at a strategic planning level. And we could do an entire webinar on planning for talent in your organization. But in tonight's context, I'd ask you to think of it in terms of the operating plan at a really basic level. Have you put significant thought into how you organize your team this year or next year to get stuff done? Have you thought about how you assign the work, how the teams are organized, who's ready to take on more leadership? I know of a farm that has done this. They put a lot of thought into who does what, and they actually landed on a model where rather than one or two really significant crew leaders, they've intentionally assigned different people to lead different field operations throughout the year. So one person's in charge of planting, one person's in charge of tillage, one person's in charge of spraying. And they did that intentionally to play to those individual strengths and also to develop the next generation and to cross-train. And not only did they come up with this great plan, they also communicated it with everyone. So I think lots of times we as managers, we're guilty of having a plan, but maybe not always communicating it to everyone that needs to know it well or often enough. And so in this farm's case, they've actually drawn organization charts for each operation and written job descriptions, and really are trying to ingrain this concept into the whole team. So now you've seen the 5 pieces of an operating plan. So we're going to go back to our poll from earlier and ask you again, how do you think you're doing now? I guess based on my definition that you just saw of what's in an operating plan, do you think you are doing an operating plan in the sense that it determines what you'll produce based on sound analysis, it defines the resources, and it's understood and communicated with everyone? So Josh, I'll ask you to put the poll back up. So assume everybody is finishing up their voting, and Josh will get me, so our results are, now 41% of you answered somewhat, and 42% no, and 17% yes. So that doesn't surprise me. I fully expect that most of you have some aspects of what we just went through, but you may not have the full picture. And that was really my goal tonight, was just kind of to expose you to what are some of the ways you could think about planning and get you thinking about how to apply this to your particular operation. So again, if you guys can't see it, the answers were, or the results were 41% somewhat, 42% no, and 17% yes. And so congratulations to those 17% of you that said yes, and be interested to hear some of your experiences and feedback during the question and answer session on whether it's been important to your operation or not. So in closing tonight, I will just say as a final reminder, remember that this is less about perfect planning and it's more about the communication and the clarity that a planning process can provide. And finally, helping management teams and families have these conversations is what we at Ag Progress do. So please keep us in mind in the future. Having a facilitator can be powerful for a group to help navigate tricky conversations and to hold you accountable to making progress. And thus would ask you to consider Ag Progress in the future. Thanks so much for your interest tonight. I'm going to be happy to answer questions, and Ben's going to get us started on that.
Thank you to our presenter today, Devon Cook. As we move into our question and answer session, I want to invite everyone to the upcoming 2017 Cattle Industry Summer Business Meeting in Denver, Colorado on July 12th through the 15th. This is a great opportunity to hear more in-depth information on current issues and opportunities in the cattle industry, as well as help chart the course for our future. Be sure to mark your calendars and visit beefusa.org for more information about the upcoming meeting as well as YBL. We look forward to seeing you in Denver. Now I'll turn it over to Devon for our question and answer session. Thank you again for participating in the webinar tonight. Devon, I have a question to go ahead and get things started off here. and it's a fairly loaded question, so I'm going to start you out tough.
Ouch.
When you talked about getting the right people on the bus and getting the wrong people off, you mentioned it is extremely difficult and can be fairly time-consuming to make that decision. How do you go about trying to encourage current employees to, for lack of a better term, step it up and possibly move on to ownership or responsibilities that they currently do not partake in?
Thanks, Ben. So I think, so the question, if I understood right, was how do you go about encouraging people that you, clarify for me, are you asking about people that you think you might want off the bus, or are you talking about people that you want on the bus but you just want to help them get to the next level?
All of the above.
Okay, great question. You know, dealing with people is just something that I spend a lot of time on, and it's not easy, but I will say to all of you, you know, on a young beef leader seminar, putting yourself in a leadership position in your organizations, that it's a really important management skill that you're gonna have to invest time and effort into developing. And part of it's experience, but there's also skills you can build. And so, you know, what I see a lot of clients going through right now is growth. And so maybe a generation ago, if you think of that family business life cycle that I showed you earlier, you know, they were in survival or stable mode, and it was a small number of people. And now your businesses are growing, and all of a sudden we have 5, 10, 15, 25 employees, and we're kind of like, oh, wow, we gotta get our stuff together, because these people actually want to know what their career path is, or they want feedback, or that's not even to mention, you know, the administrative side of HR, of benefits and so forth. But I think the most important thing, you're going to get this theme from me tonight, is if you're not talking about it, people are making up a story. In the absence of a story, are people making it up? So in this context of encouraging your employees, you know, that story or that conversation may be about giving them regular feedback. And I actually like to call it feed forward, because the point is to have a conversation about what you're going to do better going forward, or what you're going to keep doing great going forward. So it's future focused, and it's about how are we going to develop you into a better team member. So for your question, to encourage them to step up, I think you're having regular conversations and saying, hey, here's the opportunities I see for you here. In our operating plan this year, I'm going to work towards giving you more responsibility. You know, one of our goals for this year is X, and I really want you to be the leader on that. So first of all, it's thinking about where they fit and giving them a vision of how that could succeed. But then you also got to support them on the way. So supporting them on the way is everything from providing them the right training. I mean, what training do you need to send them to? But it's also really, really regular communication. So I have a client right now who I'm coaching some, who's really trying to step it up in how he manages his team of like 6 or 8 farm employees. And he had to put in place actually a weekly conversation with each person. Now it's like 10 or 15 minutes. It's not a lot of time, but you know, Tuesday morning, Bob knows he's going to be in there at 7:30 to have this conversation, and Wednesday morning, Joe knows. And that weekly conversation is just really quick of like, here's what I saw you do great the last week. Here's what I want you to focus on this week. What questions do you have for me? What do you need from me to make you successful this week? And for him, that's been a really great way to get started. And, you know, at some point in time, he may not need those conversations every week. It may go to every other week or once a month, but it has totally changed the way his employees interact with him and are willing to come to him with suggestions or ask for help when they need it. So hopefully, I know I gave you a lot of different ideas there, but hopefully that gets you thinking.
Yeah, yep, thank you very much. And I encourage others to, as mentioned earlier, to type their questions in the chat box, and we will get those taken care of.
Hey, Devon, this is Josh at NCBA. Going to moderate out a few of these questions. We've got one about, you mentioned early on when you were talking about the marketing piece, that a lot of times organization or family will need to have make some decisions around the governance of decision making for various items. So could you give us some tips on how to have that conversation, how to make that decision on who those people are?
Okay. Yeah. And like I said, this is kind of something that we've been having more conversations about this in the last year. So what kind of the template that we like to use is to think about checks and balances of splitting up the executor of your marketing plan with another group of people that are a bit of the consultant and oversight. And so when I say group of people, I mean, it can be a committee of 5 or it can be one person. I mean, it could be your banker who says, yeah, I want to be on the checks and balances of this because I know what it means to the margin calls that are going to come into your line of credit. But the idea is that you set up front. I mean, the best case or the best practice from my perspective is you definitely have a written marketing plan that you can communicate with all of the shareholders of your organization to say, you know, here's how we plan to sell, here's where we plan to sell, here's the tools we'll use, here's our risk tolerance. This is what I am planning to go execute for this year. And so the first step is everybody has agreed and endorsed that marketing plan. And then you have some parameters where this person that's executing, you know, has a line of credit for margin calls. But once it gets to a certain threshold, that's where, oh, hey, we got to go consult. We got to go back to the bigger group and get approval, or at least, you know, make everyone aware of what's going on. Because what you don't want to happen is the surprises. I mean, you don't want your partners to find out 3 years from now that things have, or not 3 years, I'm sorry, 3 months from now, that things have gone south and, you know, we lost a lot of money with a bad position. That's where the conflict and the mistrust can really be a problem. And, you know, it works, I mean, both frustration with you as the executor, but also just the stress. I mean, I see this all the time too, just the stress that that person is carrying. And man, they have good intentions and they're, you know, they're doing the best they can with whatever tools and advice they have. But it's just a hard place to be in. And so the more you can, as a group, define kind of what the ditches are so that you stay on the road, the better off you are. And part of that defining it has to be, in my mind, regular reporting. So an expectation that either at a monthly management meeting or owners meeting or at least quarterly, there's kind of a standard format that this person that's executing is reporting on, so that everybody is getting more educated and there's no surprises later on. And just one aspect as far as the checks and balances thing, I do think it's a good idea if you have somebody available is to involve somebody that's a little bit outside of the day-to-day to be your oversight. So let's say in my example, if that is your banker. So if I'm the marketing executor, I have to check in with that banker with a pretty simple report once a month that says, here's what I'm doing. And that person, they're a little bit more impartial and they're out of the kind of some of the day-to-day politics of the business, and they can call timeout and say, whoa, 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 this is getting off track from what we agreed to in this marketing plan. And it really gives all the other people some confidence that there is a check and balance in place.
All right, here's a really easy question. Someone wanted to know the name of the author of Traction, the book you mentioned early on.
Gino Wickham.
Excellent.
If you Google it on or if you put it in Amazon, you will find it.
So here's one that's a little more in depth, and I think this will probably apply to a lot of young or beginning producers. This participant's asking, so if your operation, your ag enterprise is a secondary source of income and you're working off the farm or part-time in another enterprise, how do you decide how to spend your time? How do you decide you know, how to make that transition of time and energy and focus on the farm enterprise versus other things that may be making you money?
That's a great question and a tough situation to be in. You know, I guess here's the reality, guys. I mean, we all do the best we can do. We do the best we can at whatever we're doing, right? So if you're a split, you know, if your time is split, so you obviously want to be successful at your other job and you want to do right by your farming or ranching enterprise. So there's going to be limits. You're not going to be able to do everything as in depth. But I do think that's where some of the stuff I went through tonight around both really understanding what's your long-term strategic plan. I mean, if for you the strategic plan is, I want to be full-time on the farm in 3 years, then you really need to be putting specific goals in place year by year to get you there. And so having that big picture decided and having a clear path of how you get there, I think becomes even more important. And then in the operating plan context, you know, I'm guessing that your decision to go full-time at the farm or not is probably clearly driven by the financial ability to do so. So that's where I think investing the time in that financial planning aspect that I went through first on the operating plan, as far as, do you have a good budget? Are you doing really good profit and loss projections to understand where you're at? You know, sure, you understand at the end of the year how much money's in the bank account, but to really understand the drivers of that profitability would be pretty important for me if I were in your shoes, to think about taking the leap from giving up an off-farm job to trying to go full-time. Really understanding your financials is critical from my perspective. I hope I answered the question. I guess if I didn't, type back and tell Josh I didn't.
I think that was good. Another interesting question here, for somewhat larger, so not just maybe a family specific operation that's trying to attract employees and offer a competitive package. Do you have any suggestions on the benefits packages that maybe some of those, you know, more medium to large size but production oriented enterprises are offering? Or do you have any tips for, you know, what matters to a potential employee in that list of benefits?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think I have the silver bullet answer to that. And that's, you know, it's already we can see tonight 2 out of the questions so far have been about people issues. So I was right in saying that, you know, this is definitely a pain point that I hear all the time. I don't have the silver bullet answer. I just would say that, you know, at the end of the day, you've got to figure out how your people are motivated and what drives them. And in a smaller operation, you may have some flexibility to customize that. And so that can be an asset. You know, one person may really value housing and one person may really value, you know, days off or having every Saturday off or whatever. So the more you can customize that, if it's feasible based on the size of your operation, that's one strategy. The other thing I would say as a best practice is to make sure your employees understand what the value of all those fringe benefits is. And I've seen numerous tools and use some of them for, you know, just a little worksheet to monetize and put a dollar value and add up for each of your employees what the total bottom dollar is. So, you know, it's not just salary and bonus, but it's house and it's gas and it's the meat you gave them and it's the health insurance and it's, you know, if you add all those things up, it comes to a much bigger number. And I will tell you, you don't do that once. I mean, they don't see it once and you never have this conversation again. I haven't seen that be totally, totally successful. But it's a conversation you get in the habit of having every year. So whenever you're sitting down having your salary talk, you update this every year and say, hey, I just want you to let's just review what your benefit package is here. So that education can actually be pretty helpful. And for family members too, honestly. Sometimes as family members, we kind of start thinking we're getting the short end of the stick or we might not be getting compensated well, but sometimes those fringe benefits add up to quite a bit. And I see it in a family context really helpful to get everybody on the same page of understanding who's getting what.
All right, another question related to marketing, and this is pretty cattle specific, but there are a lot of outfits that have multiple market endpoints or potential market targets they're trying to hit. For instance, a purebred operation may be hoping to produce purebred seed stock, but if the animal doesn't perform as well, may end up in a commercial marketing sector that's not as valuable. Do you have any tips for planning around some of those market points that may really have quite a bit of differentiation in the value and affect your budget down the line?
So I will not pretend to have any cattle market expertise. So the short answer is I don't have action tips for you. I'd open it up to Ben or Josh if they want to comment, but just the only planning tip I would say to you is scenario analysis. I mean, when you're doing those worksheets, do your scenario of the best case and do your scenario of the worst case, and make sure you have a plan if the worst case comes about. I mean, what does that impact on your financing and so forth? So just make sure you are running those right scenarios. But I'm sorry, beyond that, that's not my expertise area.
Yeah, I guess one other tip that I would just add would be tracking those percentages that are hitting each target over a period of time. If you will keep some records, then you can base future planning on previous results, right? Yeah. Maybe give you some hint at least at the percentages you're hitting each year, and then you can also set some goals against that. Another question was more tactical. For those of us in the cattle industry, you did share some examples of templates, especially on the production piece of the operating plan. Do you have any livestock or cattle specific resources that you would recommend? I know you did show one from UNL, I think. Any other cattle specific resources or tools that you've seen out there that you might be willing to share?
So I would say, you know, most of the ones I see are extension based. So I would be focusing on your state's extension system because that's going to have, you know, the most relevant data to your production system. You know, and I know there's various seminars out there like Ranching for Profit has some good tools. Beyond that, I don't get into that often enough to really have a strong preference to tell you, you know, which one I think is better or worse.
Yeah, and I would just echo that on extension. You know, what we typically see is there are definitely regional leaders in cattle or livestock in the extension field. So even if your state doesn't have something specific, then maybe you know of a neighboring state where perhaps they're sending extension speakers into your Cattlemen's College program in your state, et cetera. So you can recognize some of the thought leaders there and look for resources. And feel free to also respond into the survey system at the end of our webinar or into the Q&A if you have a specific ask, and we can try to help connect you with those resources from Extension.
Great.
Looks like we've knocked out most of these questions. Do you have any closing comments, Devon, before we wrap up?
Well, I want to thank everybody again for the opportunity, and I'll say my mantra again. It's not about doing this perfect. It's about getting the conversation started. So, you know, you build valuable information by communicating and by adding clarity. And so just get started.
Well, thank you, Devon, for doing a great job for us tonight. Tons of great information. As we mentioned earlier, this is being recorded, and you'll all get a link to it. So if you want to go back and look at some of those slides or hear Devon's earlier comments, they are recorded. And thanks again. Hope everyone has a great night, and we hope to see you at Summer Business Meeting. And thank you, Ben, for hosting as well.